Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of Out of Character, the show where your favorite creators drop out of character for an hour to talk with game designer and host Marc Tassin, that'd be me, about their art, their process, and all the nerdy stuff that inspires them. From the secrets behind their craft to the ins and outs of the business to the games, shows, and books that they can't get enough of, it's a unique and candid look at the people who create the stuff you and I love. Now, as always, comments will be open on Twitch. So if you have things that you want to ask or comments you want to make, feel free to drop them in there. We'll do our best to pull some of those in as we're talking. And so with all of that out of the way, let me introduce this week's guest, Stephen S. Long. Hey, Steve, how's it going?
Hey, Marc. It's going great. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us. So,
thanks for having me on.
Oh, happy to. So for the folks who are watching, tell us a little bit about what you create.
All right. I am mainly known in the creative field for my work as a designer of tabletop RPGs. I'm most strongly connected with Champions and the Hero system, of which I am part owner and have been the chief creative and design force for the past 25 years or so. But I've also, as a freelancer, written for most of the major companies in the industry as of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. It's been so long since I did a lot of freelancing that the landscape has kind of changed underneath me. But I also write fiction and nonfiction and basically anything that interests me that comes down the pike.
So I want to ask you, my first question is, how did you start gaming? What was your introduction to role-playing games?
Well, I started gaming for basically as an outgrowth of my interest in fantasy and science fiction. When in the early 80s, when I was in junior high, I guess, coming up on high school, I got into reading fantasy and science fiction. I don't remember exactly how, but as with most other interests in my life, when I dove in deep. And one day I read a story in the newspaper or a magazine, because this was back before the internet was available to the public, about this game where you could play a fantasy character. And I'm like, this sounds fascinating. And I was, by riding my bike all over town to several different places, was able to, first I got the blue book edition of D&D that carried 1 through 3rd level. And then I got a copy of the player's handbook, and it all went from there. And then one day, after I'd been playing mostly D&D with a little Traveler and other things, heard about this great new superhero game. And I'd recently gotten back into reading comics, and that game happened to be Champions. And that quickly became, we ended up dropping all other games in favor of using the hero system, not just for superheroes, but for fantasy and everything else. And eventually that led me to become a creator rather than just a consumer.
Well, and a major creator when it comes to Champions and Hero. What was it about that system that when you first picked it up and started playing it, what caught you that the other games just didn't have?
The utter freedom of character design and the way it would let me design the character that I had in mind, not the character as envisioned by the designer of the game or what have you, but the character that I wanted. Using the generic elements of the hero system, I could put things together that made it possible for me to come up with the character that I was envisioning in my head, and therefore made it easier and more fun to role play. The other thing that really opened my eyes at the time, though I think nowadays it's kind of taken for granted, was the concept of having what were then called disadvantages, what are now called complications, as a way of driving your character's story. You got points for them, sure, and that was the initial reason to take them. But the fact is, every disadvantage or complication is really a storytelling hook for the GM to use. And I was fortunate early on to have several great GMs who did a fantastic job with exploiting the fact that I had a secret identity, that I had a dependent non-player character, this, that, and the other. It was very well handled. And again, I was fortunate in that. Having a really good GM is worth its weight in gold.
Yeah, right. Well, and I mean, and that's one of the things that I love about the system as well, is that richness where it's not just about what's the powers that you have, but it's more about what are the things, the challenges that you have to overcome in order to use those in the way that you want to use them, in order to be the hero you want to be. while still dealing with all of those complications.
Yep, exactly.
So when you started playing it, you've played it for years. What happened that you went from playing it to driving the bus, right?
Well,
Where was the
I
crossover for you?
this was that all came about when I was in, I want to say, second year in law school. I was at law school at Duke, and at the time, Hero Games had a quarterly magazine called Adventurers Club. Now, the gag was it was quarterly because it came out once every 4 years, because for a while the publication was a little irregular, but they did get better with it. And at one point in issue 16, I think it was, they put out, an ad saying, our next issue is going to focus on Western stuff and on martial arts. So if you have articles you think we'd be interested in, contact us. I had
Uh-huh.
just that weekend finished writing up a whole bunch of fictional martial arts for my own champions slash what we would now call Dark Champions campaign,
Mhm.
inspired by a single comic paddle in an issue of the Shadow Strikes. Um, and so it had inspired me to write all these up. So I wrote a letter to Iron Crown Enterprises, who was controlling things. Again, no internet. Had to write, there you go. And I said, I've got this article. Would you be interested? And they wrote me back and said, yeah, we'd love to see it. And so, like, I canceled my game for that Friday and immediately sat down writing. And before you know it, I sent in an article, and the writing bug had kind of bit. I did some more articles and contributed to one of their collection books, Fantasy Hero Companion 2. And then I decided, what the hell? I could write a whole book. And what I wanted to do, what I ended up doing, and what sort of made my place in the industry was, at the time, back in the 90s, vigilantes, or what some people call anti-heroes like the Punisher and so forth, had become very popular. And in fact, the type of character I was mainly playing at the time, the Harbinger of Justice, was exactly that sort of character. And I was continually frustrated by the fact that all of the published material, and therefore most of the adventures that were being run, were focused on your traditional four-color superheroics.
Yeah.
You know, and added to that, my own knowledge of the law and of organized crime and so forth made me, the GM would give a clue and I would jump to a conclusion based on my own knowledge that was totally unwarranted and screwed the whole thing up. So I decided I want to write a book that covers this type of campaign, so that A, more GMs will run this type of game so I can play in them, and B, so that they will have the knowledge to run them with greater verisimilitude. Let's not call it realism, but greater verisimilitude. And they loved the idea when I pitched it, and that became Dark Champions.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And of course, going forward, then you were right when you made your assumptions because that's what the game was and you had written the rules for it. So,
Yeah, I know. I was actually figuring it up the other day that basically, I started writing rules oriented as opposed to genre or setting oriented material for Hero Games with their first Ultimate books back in the mid 90s. The Ultimate Martial Artist, the first Ultimate Mentalist. And since then, and then I wrote the fifth edition rulebook for them that they never ended up publishing, that was eventually published by me and my partners.
mhm.
But what it boiled down to is, it occurred to me that since about 1993 or 4, there has been no significant amount of rules related material written for the hero system by anyone but me.
Huh.
Because partly because when the company was in the doldrums in the 90s, people weren't champing at the bit necessarily to write for them.
Right.
And since my partners and I bought the Hero Games assets, I've been doing all the writing.
Yeah.
I generally am not one to farm things out. I'd rather write them myself. And then if freelancers come to me with a great idea, like Scott Benny's Villainy Amok, for example, which we published,
Mhm.
I'm happy to take that on. But it's usually just, I like to write. I like to think I'm good at it. So I just prefer to go ahead and tackle those things myself.
Right. Well, so I have a question. You were talking about fifth edition and now
Mhm.
Heroes in sixth edition,
Yeah,
right? One of the things that creates a lot of angst are new additions.
sure.
And I mean, what sort of thoughts as a publisher, as a writer, What sort of things did you have to consider and did you think about when you were talking about maybe it's time to do a new edition? I mean, how much risk is there? It feels like it would be a risky move for a company, and yet something that you felt was the right thing to do all the same.
Yeah, no, there definitely is some risk there, but there are a couple of competing factors here. In telling this, I'm going to be pulling the curtain back a little bit on some of how the industry works, but
Hmm.
there are two basic reasons to publish a new edition of a role-playing game. One is you believe you can improve it. And in this
Hmm.
case, we with the sixth edition, we'd had the fifth edition out for 6 or 7 years.
Hmm.
In that time, because we had revitalized the company and been very active in working with the fans and talking to them and answering their questions, I had accumulated a lot of rules material for our frequently asked questions file. In fact, it was really more of an infrequently asked questions file because some of the questions were very obscure and nitpicky things uh,
Right.
that probably only mattered to the person asking them. But so that's the first reason I thought I could make it better, not only in terms of the rules, but in terms of the presentation,
Right.
because the fifth edition rule books were hardcover, but they were black and white, and we
Hmm.
now had access to more funding and better art, so we could do color books. The other reason, pure and simple, is financial.
Yeah.
There reaches a point where you publish a role playing game and then you start publishing supplements for it and settings and books of gadgets and what have you. But sooner or later, the sales for the supplements taper off. Early
Hmm.
on, you get all the ideas that are really obvious and big, like the gadgets book or the villains book, or the main setting, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
people buy a lot of those. But as you step down from that, people buy fewer and fewer. And eventually, you publish a new edition, whether you really genuinely need one or not for improvement purposes, because you need to revitalize the purchasing power. So you come out with a new edition, and then you also have to come out with, new editions of those core books. So, for example, for sixth edition, we had to redo the Champions and Fantasy Hero and Star Hero genre books. We
Yeah.
had to redo the martial arts book and the gadgets book and the big grimoire of spells. Um, but at that point, I think they were organized much better and presented much better, so that we had what I call the Hero System core library, and then things that are outside of the core library but still fun that people can buy. And at this point, with the whole concept of the long tail, if you will,
Yeah.
you know we can sell, and we do sell, you know supplements from all six editions of the game in PDF form.
Hmm.
We don't offer any support for other editions than the six, but we do sell them
Yeah.
because there are people who still want them for nostalgia purposes or because they can be used. The
Yeah.
truth is that somebody who played Champions using the very first edition of the rulebook could take a look at a sixth edition character sheet and understand 90% of it without blinking.
Hmm.
Some of it would require a little adjustment in thinking, and there'd be some differences in how characteristics are presented and so forth. But the basic terminology of the game and how things are bought and used has never really changed.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's interesting because I think a lot of people don't think about that when they see these new additions, remembering that if the company doesn't remain financially viable, there won't be any new anything,
Yeah,
right? At the end of the day, is that you do have to keep it alive as a business if you want to keep producing stuff. As frustrating as that might be, it'd be nice if you could just do it art for the sake of art. But if the business is going to make enough money to pay the people to keep doing it, you got
yeah.
to make those
I mean,
decisions
the
sometimes.
other way to do it, of course, is to have a large backlog of what are called evergreen titles, titles that
Mhm.
always sell. For most RPGs, the only art, you know, title like that is the core rule book. That's the one
Yeah.
evergreen. You With Hero, we have several, but the trick is you have to have enough new people coming in to buy those core books and so forth and so on. And unfortunately, as much as I'd like to, we don't have the player base of Pathfinder or D&D.
Right.
So things change. But we've had the sixth edition now for going on 15 years.
Mhm.
So, and I don't see any. I At this point, I don't think I could improve it except in the presentation. I would
Yeah.
present it differently, but I don't have enough rules changes that I want to make that I think it would justify doing a new edition. And
I
even then, it of course is a huge expense to do one, because you have massive, art bills and then printing bills that all have to be paid up front. Though Kickstarter these days lets you step around some of those difficulties on
Yeah.
occasion.
Yeah. Thinking about these new editions and the work that goes into them and bringing them out. Um, First off, you said I'm sitting here trying to get my head on straight because you said 15 years since sixth edition came out, and my
Getting
brain
close to
just
it, yeah.
snapped because in my brain it just came out. So I'm clearly getting old. So I was like, wait, sixth edition just came out. What
I know the feeling, believe me.
happened? No, the thing I was thinking about is that the ability to sell older versions, right? That's something that didn't used to happen very much, and it feels like it's something that's sort of with the rise of PDFs and ebooks and things and print on demand. These older books are available, and I think that's kind of awesome because these different older systems sometimes offer you a different experience, and what a great opportunity for another income stream for a game company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what really got us started on that bandwagon was working with Alan Varney and his Humble Bundle, or bag
Yeah.
of holding, bundle of holding project, um, because he wanted to do one with older hero products, and
Hmm.
that gave us enough of an incentive to go back and you know make digital copies of ones that were published years before there was any notion of a digital copy,
Yeah.
you of a book. So, and they've been selling ever since, because there's nostalgia, there's a desire to see the material, because the adventures are still perfectly good, the settings are still perfectly good. Like for me, I've gone back and bought in PDF form a lot of the old first edition D&D books that I love so much,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that I can flip through them just for the fun of it, online if I feel like it. And I've bought a lot of books, you know, PDF copies through Kickstarters and things that I would otherwise just have ignored,
Yeah.
because, like, okay, that's an interesting concept, but I know I'm never going to play it. I'm not going to invest $50 in this book,
Yeah.
for a game I'll never play, but $20 for a PDF copy in the hopes that maybe someday I'll get a chance to play it. Okay, that's worthwhile.
I think
If
that's
it
pretty cool.
Yeah,
And
if
I
it
mean, the
strikes
whole
my,
market has changed.
interests and desires, like, I'm really fascinated by and have studied extensively Norse mythology, and
Hmm.
so any game with a Norse or Viking kind of setting usually, attracts me to at least take a good hard look.
Yeah.
Everybody has their own thing like that, I'm sure.
I hope you've checked out Lou Anders' Thrones and Bones fifth edition game.
I remember taking a look at it, and I think I meant to order it and forgot, but I'm glad you reminded me, because
A
I'll
reminder
get
to
back
you
to
and
it.
to anyone else who's listening,
Because
Lou Anders.
I know Lou Anders' work. He does good stuff.
Yeah, and what's interesting with those is they actually were a set of middle grade books originally,
Hmm.
and he then created a setting more for adults, which is kind of cool. But you kind of are touching on something that I think is interesting, and that you've seen sort of an adaptation or a change over time. This whole idea of how books come to market these days, it's
Mhm.
like a completely different world. I mean, do you think that for the most part it's for the better, or do you think that there are things that are lost along the way, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think, well, I'm not really in a position to comment on how it would affect the fiction publishing world, though I'm sure it
Yeah.
has. But I think in the RPG world, it's been an absolute home run positive thing. It has
Hmm.
enabled many people to get their product to market that otherwise never would have, because getting picked up by traditional distribution was always tough. You know, Here you can speak directly to your audience and attract their attention without any middleman getting in between. And because it allows you to determine the financial risk in advance, you don't have to print the book and cross your fingers and hope and pray that it'll sell enough to make up your expenses. You know
Right.
already, if you've done your planning properly, that your Kickstarter has funded and therefore you're good to go, or it didn't fund and therefore the consumer interest just wasn't there. And so your choice is either to publish it yourself with some kind of vanity project, or let it go, or maybe try again in a year or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, what happened to a lot of companies is they just watched, that one book did them in, right? They did their
Yeah.
book. They couldn't sell enough to get the money back because it's a pretty niche market, right? I
Yeah.
mean, from a business perspective, it's not like there's a huge opportunities for folks who are doing this,
No,
right?
there's
And
not a lot of money to be made in RPGs. Anybody who goes into RPGs thinking they'll make money is mostly diluted. Yeah, I mean, some companies have done it for certain periods of time, but even then, those companies tend to get in financial trouble sooner or later, because the fact is that the RPG market isn't as that big to begin with compared to, for example, the traditional fiction market. And two, the skills of designing a game are not necessarily the skills of marketing that game or running a company. I know more than one talented creator who's basically abandoned the industry for that reason. You
Yeah.
can't make enough money to hire a staff to do these things for you, you know,
Mhm.
so you've got to do them yourself, and you probably don't enjoy them. You just want to design games, but
I one time saw the numbers for the entire RPG industry,
yeah,
where someone had sort of estimated the numbers. And if you leave out Hasbro, right, that's
yeah,
a
I've seen some of
outlier.
those numbers as well.
And if you look at that, I also was, because of my work in software, I've been looking at venture capitalists and
Yeah,
realized that the entire industry, if they all got together and formed a single company, wouldn't make enough money to attract venture capital funds.
yeah,
And it just sort of helps you to recognize, like, it is a very niche market where fans are selling to fans. And at the end of the day is what it really seems it
yeah.
is.
It is. I used to joke that you get into RPG publishing so you have books to give away to your friends, so they'll give you their books when they print them.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but which is true to a certain extent anyway. But if you're in publishing, you want people to read your book, so you give it away.
Yeah.
But you know the truth is that without something like Kickstarter, I mean, Kickstarter is, I think, really in many ways what got the whole indie game design thing, you know, really running. I mean, it started before Kickstarter, long before, and it was doing fine on its own.
Hmm.
But the ability for someone who he has this great idea for this little game that's going to appeal to maybe 100 people, now he can put it out there. There's a market of indie game fans who look for these things, and you can get enough of those 100 people to make a usually inexpensive printing and get your game out there. And every now and then one of those games is a huge hit, like Fiasco, for
Yes,
instance. I
exactly.
don't think Fiasco started with Kickstarter, but it's one of those type of products. It's a small thing, easily produced, and put out to the masses.
Yeah.
Um, but
Catches fire and
most,
everyone's on it.
yeah,
Yeah.
most games are not going to be like that. But I know my company owns and runs Indie Press Revolution, so
Mhm.
I don't pay a lot of attention to it. It's more my business partner, Jason Walters, but he pays very close attention to that side of the industry. And, by acting as a sort of fulfillment distributor kind of thing for these people, we can get their games into some stores, we can carry them at conventions, we can expose them to markets that they won't necessarily be exposed to online. Because,
Mhm.
not every game fan, RPG player, spends significant amounts of his waking time trolling the internet looking for new games. Some people do it constantly, you know,
As
but
a guy who
any
owns a
way you
small
can reach
game
a
company,
customer, is good.
as a
You know,
guy who owns a small game company, I will definitely agree. It's difficult,
absolutely.
right, to kind of get your name out there. People find it, they like it, but how do they find it? And so there's
Yeah.
a business there as well. I think another thing that's interesting is the improvement in the growth of the print on demand industry. And
Yeah.
if you look at things like drive through RPG, one of the biggest challenges with me early on when I was trying to get published was, coming up with 10 grand for a print run. Even if you were to do Kickstarter, sometimes that's a lot of money to come up
Yeah.
with, buy, and you might maybe buy more books than you could ever possibly sell, right? Would be your minimum purchase back then. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to see how that's kind of changed things as well, where people can have this opportunity to get into print in a pretty good quality book, where that has, really improved over time.
Yeah. No, that absolutely has also helped. So has the revolution in desktop publishing software that makes it
Yeah.
easy for even a fumble fingers guy like me can lay out an RPG book that looks respectable enough to sell. It's not going to look as good as something produced by a real layout genius like Fred Hicks, for example.
Yeah. Right.
But it's enough that I don't feel ashamed to put my name on it. Uh, so that I think helps a great deal, because it used to be that if you could get a printer to pay attention to you, which was often difficult when you had no track record,
Hmm.
The minimum they would want to do might be 3 or 4,000 copies, and
Right.
most RPGs don't meet that threshold. I don't believe.
No.
And so you're stuck with a garage full of boxes of books that are never going to sell. You know,
And there's no more of a morale crusher than the weight of a couple thousand books that have never sold looking at you every time you go out to get in your car.
yeah. I mean, I every time I do a panel at a convention, talking about getting into the industry and what you can expect, I always get at least one or two people during the panel or afterwards, complaining about how pessimistic I am. And I'm like, yeah, okay. There are success stories, but you got to go into this with open eyes. You
Yeah.
know, if you don't, you're just setting yourself up for abject failure and losing a lot of money. You
Yeah.
know, do not spend any money creating and publishing an RPG that you cannot afford to simply throw out the window as you drive down the road. If you
Yeah.
can't afford to lose it, don't spend it, because the odds are you're not going to get your money back. If you're not willing to be paid in the satisfaction of having your book in print, then think carefully about what you're doing.
Well, and you know what? And that's the thing is that at the end of the day, there's a lot of satisfaction there. There's a lot of joy in sharing that with people
Yeah.
and putting it into their hands and hearing their stories of their adventures. And that's a pretty awesome experience, especially as like I'm a game master. To me, publishing is almost like the ultimate game master role, right?
Yeah.
At that
No,
point, because you're running
it's
games
true.
across the world for people.
Yeah. I mean, I like to explain my job to people who don't really know what RPGs are. Is saying, I help people have fun. I'm not entertaining them the way a fiction writer would, though
Mhm.
RPG books can certainly be entertaining, but
Yeah.
that shouldn't be their goal necessarily. Their goal should be to present the information you need to play the game in as clear and concise a manner as possible. But I'm giving them the tools to help them entertain themselves. And I hope at least that's worth a lot of good karma, because otherwise I'm going to be kicked out of the pearly gates and right back down to the other side of the coin. So,
So I want to get to some things that are fun that we've been doing and talk about some
okay.
of that. But before we do, I do want to talk about one more business craft thing.
Okay.
And you made me think of it when you mentioned this. One of the things that I'm a firm believer in is that although it's fun to read a role-playing game book, the book is a tool to help you to run a great game. And sometimes I feel like that piece gets lost. And I feel like that's something that you're really good about saying this stuff is really cool and interesting. But I also recognize that it has to be functional, it has to be practically useful to you at the game table.
Yeah, no, that was, and I'm absolutely not knocking on anybody here, but
Yeah.
um, a lot of people who get into writing RPGs have the ultimate goal of wanting to write fiction or write comic books or write, you know, screenplays.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, and you can see that in their work because it's more likely to be entertaining. It's more likely to refer to things in vague terms. Um, and again, not to knock on anyone, but that was one of the reasons I used to get a lot of work from White Wolf back in the 90s, because they would always hire me to do the rules section or some rule section of their books, because they knew from my work on the hero system that I could write rules in a concise, clear fashion. And some of their authors, that was not their thing. But they built their empire on that thing, and they had great authors to do it. You know,
Yeah.
the rules were almost an afterthought in some ways, but they still needed to be good.
And that's really a smart business move, right?
Yeah.
The fact that they recognize that is exactly what I was talking about and we're talking about here is this idea that you can have that and that richness of story is a lot of what pulls people in,
Yes.
right? But once they get their hands on it, that's what keeps you playing every single week is being able to do it in a way that it really enables you to have a great game
Yeah.
on a week after week basis. So speaking of games, do you have any time to game these days?
Yeah. No, I have a regular gaming group that meets Friday evenings,
Okay.
and we've been gaming together for 10 or 12 years now, I think.
Hmm.
An amazing length of time, and just having a ball. I'm looking forward to this week's game. So
What do you mind telling us what you're playing right now?
no, we're playing it. We're using the hero system. We typically either use the hero system or we do some, the Pathfinder D&D 3.x kind
Yeah,
of thing.
got it. Yeah.
Right now, my one of my friends in the group, the GM, is running it's sort of a survival campaign where our characters it's in the far future. It's a star hero campaign,
Hmm.
and they have crash landed on this planet that, it isn't where they were going. They don't know what happened to put them there. There's something odd about the planet, and it hasn't been figured out initially. And we're trying to survive, build some sort of civilization, and hopefully eventually find a way to get back home.
Hmm.
So that's been a lot of fun. I mean, it's heavily inspired, I'm sure, by some of the survival themed computer games that are out there,
Yeah.
but it works just as well in a tabletop RPG format. We're 22 or 23 games in, I think, and having a lot of fun. We've reached the point where we can sort of see how we might get home, but there's a lot of work between here and the moment of lifting off and zapping back to Earth.
Well, and I'm gonna plug Hero here, the system, because what you're describing is something that Hero would excel at,
Yes.
right? I mean, the for folks who maybe haven't played it before, it's a setting agnostic system, but it's really about having a tool chest that you can use to build whatever you want within
Mhm.
your game world. And for something like that, where you want to construct, you want to build, you've got the framework there to figure out just about anything, right?
Yeah.
At that point when you're building that stuff.
Yeah. That's what the GM did. He started with the one of the tech level lists and some of the weapons lists and things like that from Star Hero, but
Hmm.
then adjusted them to suit what he had in mind, added some things, took some things away, and applied his own extensive knowledge of the Hero system to do other things, and it's worked out perfectly. The other
Yeah.
thing that I think Hero is especially good for that people don't always think about is designing magic systems.
Oh
How the
yeah.
magic works in your world and the spells that go with it. It can be a lot of work, which is why we publish big books of spells that you can adapt to your game. But the fact is, it gives you this boundless freedom to figure out how magic works in your fantasy setting and what the specific spells do. And I love
Right.
doing that. At some point, I really want to publish a book of magic systems where we collect up all the ones we've published over the years, update them as necessary, and then throw in 4 or 5 more just for fun.
Uh-huh.
Taken from my own campaigns or made up on the spot,
Yeah.
because we've got plenty of them. Could easily fill a book.
Yeah, to me, I when I do start building stuff in Hero, it's like me when I sit down with some Legos.
Hmm.
Time just starts passing very quickly, and the
Yeah,
next thing I know, I've built all this wondrous stuff, and I'm just like going, "Oh my god!"
yeah,
I can't stop myself once I start working on it.
yeah.
It's so fun.
Yeah. And, sometimes I'll get inspired to do things like that by seeing something in a movie or a comic book. I'm like, that's interesting. How would I do that in hero system terms? And I begin thinking about that, and sometimes that leads to an idea for a setting. Very rarely, it will lead to an idea for a new rule, or at least an optional rule. But you know, I find it very inspiring, and like you say, time just flies, and
Yeah.
you blink and 4 hours have gone past. But man, look at this cool list of armor types.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
All right, so uh, superheroes. You wrote Dark Champions. You said that you got back into superheroes at one point. What was your pull into superheroes? When did you discover them? How did you get excited about them?
I started following superheroes and reading comic books at a very young age, probably 7 or 8. And I was attracted to it, believe it or not, largely by the little Spider-Man bits they would have on the Electric Company, the old kid TV
Yeah.
show. And then the related comic book they published called Spidey Super Stories, which was very much a comic book for young kids. But
Uh-huh.
that led to more interest, and I continued reading them and buying them as my finances would allow off the spinner racks, because this was still when they had spinner racks at the local drugstore that I could ride my bike to. Um, until about age 12, and then for whatever reason, I fell out of reading them. But
Uh-huh.
then, 4 or 5 years later, when we started playing Champions, that got me back into reading comics again. And, I haven't ever really stopped, though I don't buy them regularly anymore, for various reasons. But, you know, I have a deep and abiding love for them that drives all of my work for Champions and for the other superhero games I've been involved with.
Right. And so do you have a character that was like your all-time favorite that maybe even to this day that was the one that just like
Oh
every
yeah,
time? Yeah.
absolutely. It's the Harbinger of Justice.
Okay.
Everybody
Yeah.
thinks he's horrifically overblown and overpowered, but I earned every one of those experience points. Every
That's
single one.
awesome.
I love playing. I haven't had a chance to play him for years. There just hasn't been a campaign that suited him. Um, but I love it. I love the moral quandaries that go with being, a ruthless killer vigilante. You know, am I justified in shooting this person in the head? You know, am I not justified? Is there a chance he's not the real person? Is he a shapeshifter? Is he so
uh,
there are all these moral calculations for me at least. It's not just randomly going around shooting people. I like answering those moral questions and philosophical issues. If I ever get around to finishing it, I actually have an indie game design of my own that focuses on all of that through the lens of sort of like modern day high quality cop shows like The Shield and The
mhm.
Wire. Um, but Lord knows if it'll ever see the light of day.
So out of curiosity, the character in the front of Dark Champions, that's not your character, is it?
The one on the cover of the fifth edition Dark Champions, yeah, that's
Yeah.
Harbinger.
Yeah, because I'm trying to bring up a picture, and I was certain of that. I just didn't want to get it wrong, but I
Yeah,
can't bring
he's
up a
on the
good
cover of
image.
the earliest Dark Champions books as well, but they changed the coloring and some other things because they felt it made for a better cover.
Got it.
But the once I was, creative director of the hero system, I could make the covers the way I wanted them.
Yeah, it's an awesome character, and I apologize. I'm trying to bring up one that's big enough for people to
No,
actually
that's
see,
okay.
and I can't because I'm like, oh, I just want to show that one off. So, were you a
Yeah, it's a
DC person
beautiful
or a
cover by Storn
Marvel?
Cook.
What's that?
It's a beautiful Storn Cook cover. Storn Cook did the art.
Oh, yeah, it's gorgeous. Storm's a fantastic artist as
Yes, he
well.
is.
Just does amazing stuff.
He and Greg Smith were the two artists I first worked with, um, and they've both been friends ever since.
So, were you a DC guy or a Marvel guy when
Very
you were
much a
reading?
Marvel guy. I
Okay.
didn't start reading DC comics until I got back into them when I was in like high school, after playing Champions. And
Hmm.
to this day, my knowledge of the DC universe is maybe 30 or 40% of my knowledge of the Marvel universe. It's
Uh-huh.
because partly because it's been around so much longer, it's a much more complicated place. And even after Crisis on Infinite Earth, Earth One, Earth Two, and Earth this and Earth that, and then what over the past 20 years they've had like what 4 or 5 major complete reboots of their setting. I've lost track. There's a website out there I think that tracks them, but I can't keep it all straight. So I stick with the basics. This is Batman. This is Superman. This is and that'll work pretty well.
I
But
read the entire Justice League from issue 1 to the current issue
wow,
as one of my missions, my latest comic missions, and it was a ride. There were moments where you're just like, "Oh my god, everything, what are they doing?" And then they see like, "Okay, we're gonna reboot the reboot to fix the reboot." And you're like going, "Oh god,
yeah.
what universe
I
are you
have a book
from? I don't
downstairs.
remember."
Yeah, I don't remember the title of it, but I got the author of the book sat down and read all 45,000 comic books that Marvel published, every single one, between the debut of the Fantastic Four and up to whatever point he started writing the book. So 45,000 comics, and then wrote about the experience. And I'm really looking forward to getting to this book because it'll be interesting to see how a man driven mad by such a thing will explain his experiences to those of us who are at least theoretically sane.
So I might be up to April of 1976 on the exact same mission using the Marvel Ultimate. I started Fantastic Four #1. I'm going month by month, and I'm reading every single issue, and I'm up to
I'll dig out the title of the
76.
book and send it to you because I'm sure you'll get a kick out of it.
I probably will because I mean it's fascinating. Even like, all right, so as a comic book nerd,
Yeah,
things like seeing the appearance of sound effects for the
yeah,
first time, which weren't there in the early issues, right? To
yeah,
see Mark moments where I first heard the words "It's clobbering time"
yeah,
uttered, things like that. There were moments, or the first time Thwip appeared in a comic book. It wasn't even a Spidey issue. It was a different comic that had Spidey in it. And it's
Okay.
all of a sudden goes flip, flip. I'm like, oh, there it is.
There it is.
That's it. I've been waiting for that, right?
I think doing the project the way you're doing it, trying to read month by month, is probably gives you a much better feel for how things were and what was being published and the trends.
Yeah.
Because if you just read each one straight through, you're going to lose a lot of the chronological relevance.
Yeah.
Some
Yep.
of like the classic uh, Amazing Spider-Man 97 to 99, the drug storyline, the first one that
Yeah.
didn't have the Comics Code Authority. You can pretty much pin that in time, and you can pin some other things when they have references to the Olympics or to some other event. But usually it's all in this, timeless sort of setting where major events happen and somehow never affect the world. It goes back to being the exact same, you know.
Well, I think what's fascinating to me is that the Marvel Comics universe is dealing with the real world problems every single issue from the beginning.
Yeah.
Every problem the world is dealing with, the characters are dealing with. Every social challenge the characters are dealing with in ways that is really pretty courageous and probably unexpected for some people to see. They think that this is sort of a new thing in comics, and it's really not. Comics have been challenging themselves to deal with these sort of social issues, at least Marvel has, since the very beginning.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating to read and sort of get a sense, and it also helps to put perspective on our own time, because you're like going, people were pretty worried about everything that was going on in 1976. They were
Yeah.
pretty stressed out about it.
Yeah, it turned out okay. But yeah, it's I mean, that's what made Marvel a success, was they were dealing with these real life sort of things, and readers could identify with, hey, I'm a teenager in high school. I know what that's like to be picked on by the Flash Thompsons of the world,
Right.
and the DC characters, I mean, as holdovers from the early Silver Age, and even the Golden Age in some cases, were above that. They were written in a, I don't want to say simpler, because simpler is not accurate, but
No.
from a different perspective, perhaps, where there was going to be a weird or wacky situation, and it was going to be solved by the end of the issue or maybe the end of the next issue, and everything would be fine. And on top of that, in a more meta level, and this has been addressed sometime or occasionally in more recent comics, is that the DC heroes are on average so much more powerful than an average man. And it's not that the Marvel heroes, some of them aren't, but Spider-Man, for example, seems like a very common, down-to-earth guy compared to Superman or
Yeah.
Batman. He's more identifiable. Um,
Well, even just reading through the Justice League, the challenges they faced threaten the world every issue.
yeah,
Right. And I think that was part of it too. Even Thor is dealing with small issues that are on his level around him. Whereas the Justice League, when I read through it, every issue, the world's at stake. Right. And it's like,
yeah,
that's a different sort of feel, which I loved it, by the way.
yeah.
Obviously, I read through the whole thing.
But I mean,
So,
you got it, to threaten a team of heroes to begin with. You need a big challenge, but a team of heroes that powerful, Superman alone needs a huge challenge. And when he's backed up by Green Lantern and Batman and Wonder Woman
yeah.
and the Flash,
And
you,
Flash and
you,
occasionally Aquaman, but he's
yeah,
there for moral support.
it's a different perspective. And both are equally good. I'm not saying that one is bad and the other is
Yeah,
better.
absolutely.
Something about the Marvel approach just appealed to me more as a kid, and then later as an adult.
Yeah. I will say that in terms of DC, the thing that made me a DC fan was the Bruce Timm Batman series from the 90s.
That did a lot. I mean, I've always been a Batman fan, always have been.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Batman the animated series and the comics that followed from it were it was such an amazing new and yet the same take on Batman. I was reading something earlier today or yesterday about animated shows that more or less failed but should have been big successes. And
Yeah.
one of them was a short-lived show called The Batman that came out apparently several years ago. I've never watched it,
Hmm.
but the point that section of the article made was that after Batman the animated series, everybody else is trying to live up to that level of quality, and
Yeah.
they might be really wonderful, but no one has even come close to that level of quality yet, and that makes it hard. Bruce Timm and Paul Dini, was it? I think,
Yeah, yeah.
you set such a high bar that it's difficult for anyone else to measure up. Just like it's difficult for some people to measure up to some things Kirby did and some things John Byrne did, and
Yeah.
you know,
Well, and
so
I
forth
think
and so
that
on.
for me, when dealing with anything like that, whether it's an iconic character or tropes, for example, there's this ability that some people have and that I am constantly striving for is how do you find the essence of that and bring that out so that it strikes that chord, it resonates. You hit that resonance point with the readers. That's like going, yes, this is why I love this thing, right?
Yeah,
And I
I
feel
mean,
like occasionally they do that.
I've always said, genre fiction, which would include comic books and genre movies, things like
Yeah,
that, but genre fiction as a whole is largely about the tropes and doing those tropes in ways that intrigue the reader or the viewer or what have you.
yeah,
You know, they're people are always talking about breaking genre conventions and doing something different, and sometimes that is successful. George R. R. Martin largely succeeded by breaking a lot of fantasy tropes, but the
hmm,
fact is, those tropes are tropes for a reason. People love them. Readers want them. And if you don't have them, a lot of times I think you're not going to have as broad an appeal. Now, of
yeah,
course, things can change over time. I'm sure what a late teenager, early 20 something fantasy and science fiction fan is looking for in his tropes today would be different from what I'm looking for, or at least not wholly convergent. There's probably an area of overlap in the Venn diagram,
right, yeah.
but they're going to look for things that are not what I'm going to look for, and vice versa. You know,
Yeah, I think that's the thing that to me is just so fascinating is, you know, I think when tropes fail, it's often because they're counting on the trope to carry them
mm-hmm.
rather than trying to get what it is that makes the trope so ingrained in who we
Yeah,
are.
a way to employ it that isn't necessarily different, because everything new is old. Everything's
Yeah,
been done.
yeah,
Most of it was done long before there was such a thing as a printing press. But you know, you have to find a way to make those tropes interesting again, make them come to life. Uh, you know, think, oh, that's a really neat so and so.
right.
That
Or at least, at the very least, and this is where I think Batman hit it was make you say like, that's it exactly.
yes,
It's like it's kind of like I was thinking of it like pizza, right? Some pizza's really good, but it's still pizza,
yeah,
right? Pizza's pizza, pizza, but it doesn't stop you from getting a pizza. You're just like going, that was an amazing pizza.
absolutely. It is a pinnacle expression of that particular thing, of
Hmm.
of the secret identity, or the prophecy, or you know the seemingly ordinary boy who's going to save the world.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Well, speaking of cool heroes, look what I
There you
found.
go.
There we go. I
That's
found
what
a
I'll be
good
doing.
one. I love that cover. That cover has always just been like one of my favorites.
Mine too. I have printouts of it that I keep with my gaming stuff, and you name it. It's
Uh-huh.
very evocative, and I really like it. Storn did a fantastic job, and honestly, the way Storn depicted Harbinger in the very first Dark Champions changed the way I viewed him, visualized him in my mind. Storn sort of changed my take on the character in terms of how he would look, how he would carry his gear,
Hmm.
so forth and so on. And I now have like a 8,000 word article on my computer detailing everything he has, how he carries it, where it is, and little write ups in hero system terms, to justify it all. And then I put it all on the character sheet.
That's one of the best parts about great collaboration, right? Is
Yeah.
that someone jumps in and you're all of a sudden like going, you know what? You found what was right that I didn't know was right until you did it. I'm like going, well, obviously now that I've seen it.
Yeah, for years I've wanted to do a book where normally, for a superhero villains book in particular, but any villains book, I come up with the characters and I send descriptions on them to the artist, and the artists get them back to me. They're
Yeah.
reacting to my work. I would love to do a book of villains or adversaries of some kind where The artists draw something, we give them the broad parameters of the setting. This is a superhero setting like the Marvel or DC universes. This is a general fantasy setting like Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms, or this is a specialized setting like Tekumail, or Joroon, and here are the guidelines you need to know. But then they submit the art to me for these. They come up with the characters, and I write the powers and the backgrounds based on the illustration. I think that would be a hell of a lot of fun, but for various reasons, it just has never come to fruition.
That would be awesome.
I think it would
Well,
be a hoot. As
speaking of,
a writer, as a creator, I think it's great bouncing ideas in a different direction, and I think that's one reason why they say for the past decade or so that we've really been living in kind of a golden age of TV for the past 10 or 20 years, and I think they've figured out ways to, and I have no proof of this, but to make the writer's room work better. If you get quality people and you put them in a room together and they start bouncing ideas off one another, good things are likely to result. Now, sometimes all the good things in the world aren't going to save a show that's badly managed or what have you.
Right.
But we wouldn't be consistently getting the sort of good shows we're getting if there hadn't been a real step up, I think, in how to assemble and manage writers' rooms. I'm convinced somebody's, or some general trend has led to this. But, until I become one of those people in the writers' rooms, I can't prove it.
I'm going to have to get some screenwriters on the show so we can answer that question. So
that would be a very good idea, actually.
All right. So speaking of cool things, as everyone knows, we always take a minute, and since we're almost out of time, which always happens, we run out of time. We like to put on a pedestal, put a spotlight on someone who we think folks may not have heard about, but really should. It could be a new person. It could be someone who's been around for a while that it's like going, yeah, you really should read this person. You've got someone that you've brought for us this week.
I brought along a fantasy and science fiction author named Matthew Hughes. I first learned about him through one of the Jack Vance lists that I'm on Facebook. I love the fantasy works of Jack Vance. They're just as much as I love Tolkien, even though they're completely different from Tolkien. And somebody on one of these lists read one of Hughes's books and thought it bore some resemblances stylistically, not in a pastiche sense in any way, to the way Jack Vance writes fiction. And I couldn't resist trying them out, and I read one book and immediately ordered like 8 more and read all of those too. I think he's done some great work. It's not heavy. You can get through it easily. And it's not the door stopper 3-inch thick books that so many authors produce these days. They're slender enough that you can easily carry them along and read them in a reasonable amount of time. And he creates some fascinating settings and characters. One of his main characters exists in a time where, in Vance's work, there have been different aeons of the world, and it's called the Dying Earth because we're finally in like the 21st aeon and the sun is starting to go out. But Hughes takes the same concept, but adds in or develops better an idea that some time periods are run through technology and some are run through magic. And the main character exists in a time when his technological society is starting to veer back into magic. So he's having to deal with the situations that causes that arise, investigate potential new powers and capabilities that he might have, deal with, black magicians who are willing to sell their soul to get a jump up on gathering power now, and I think it's a really intriguing concept that Hughes does a great way of exploring. But he also has science fiction stories and other things that have nothing to do with that. So there's something out there for everyone, I think. And particularly if you know and like Jack Vance's work, I think you will really like Hughes's work. But it does stand alone. It is not in any way, shape, or form, copying.
Well, that's fantastic. So everyone, you've got your assignment for this week. Go out, find some Matthew Hughes, read some Matthew Hughes, check it out. Check out his stuff, and I am definitely going to take a look because I haven't read Matthew Hughes, and I love Jack Vance. Love Vance's stuff. It's just
you'll get a kick out of it. You really like it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are out of time, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great time getting to sit and talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's not often that you and I get to sit down and just talk for an hour while somebody coming in and interrupting us needing something.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, we'll talk more, Steve. Thank you.
Absolutely. Next time I see you, first drinks are on me.
That sounds good. All right, folks. Well, that's it. You've used up another hour listening to us talk about all the things that we think are cool and fun and nerdy and that inspire us, as well as the business and the craft of everything that we're doing. And in this case, a lot about gaming. Next week, Elizabeth Bear will be here. She's an amazing speculative fiction author, fantasy, science fiction. She's great. I can't wait to have her on the show. It's going to be great. So join us again next week. And in the meantime, check out Matthew Hughes. Check out some of Steve's stuff, and we will see you later.